colleagues. My name is Montse Torremorell. I'm a faculty member at the University of Minnesota. I also serve as the department chair for the veterinary population medicine and also the chair of the planning committee for the Leman conference. On behalf of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota and myself, we want to welcome you to St. Paul and to the conference. As you take your seats, I would like, first of all, thank our sponsors. The meeting would not be possible without the generous contribution of all the sponsors who made the conference possible. So thank you. I also want to thank our program partners that they contribute to the program in many different ways, but more importantly, helping us with ideas and providing support for the speakers. So thank you for that as well. And we had some new partners this year, so thank you. We had some fun last night in the welcoming reception and poster session as well, and the session was sponsored by Boehringer Ingelheim. So thank you so much for the support. And you could see we changed things a little bit last night, so we had the reception here at the River Center, and we hope you like it. We also had fun getting to know Dr. Brunner a little bit better as part of the beer and bacon conversations, and we want to thank Elanco for sponsoring the event. We're listening to Laura. I just had to reflect on how fortunate we are in the swine industry to have professionals like Dr. Brunner sharing her experiences and contributing so much. So we thank her in this case for sharing her insights. And Laura, I will not go into some of the things said at the meeting, but it was very fun. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dean Laura Mulgar, who would like to offer her welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Monse. Good morning to everyone. It's great to see familiar faces and new faces alike at this year's Leman conference. So as Monse said, my name is Laura Mulgard. I'm a veterinarian and have the honor of serving as the dean of the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine for the last 6 years. So for the veterinarians in the room, I am here to honor your outstanding commitment to practicing swine veterinary medicine. You are on the front lines of a very demanding and vital role, ensuring the health of pigs everywhere, while helping pork producers and the industry remain profitable in good times and in bad. On campus, we are doing our part to give you all of the tools, strategies, and yes, new veterinarians to sustain this important swine industry. I think this year we should emphasize the commitment we have to investing in people. While some of our long-serving faculty have retired, Drs. Rosso, Culhane, and Molitor very recently, we have also welcomed new colleagues, Dr. Lopez, Dr. Resende, Dr. Poplowski, Dr. Kakuti, and Dr. Semenova. Some are directly involved in swine, and each brings expertise in food animals and diagnostics that strengthen our collective capacity. This renewal of talent reflects our deep commitment to supporting you through training, innovation, and partnerships. Our faculty are also deeply involved in discovering new knowledge and bringing that knowledge to practice, whether it's the MSHIMP program, advancing PRRS, strain tracking, or pioneering work on mycoplasma elimination. Their efforts demonstrate how science translates meaningful, practical solutions in the field. What began with veterinarians has grown into a broad audience. Today, the Leman Swine Conference reflects an important partnership between veterinarians, producers, and industry, as well as academics. A partnership that depends on healthy relationships. For more than 50 years, the Leman Swine Conference has fostered interactions and networking that have made the industry an important and fulfilling way of life around the world. When you come to St. Paul, you will find friends, classmates, colleagues, and new faces who will help you address your challenges and your work and life problems. And importantly, people who will challenge you to be your best self. In this pursuit of excellence, It is this pursuit of excellence that has kept this conference fresh, while an enduring reputation for presenting cutting-edge science that can be practically applied. That concept of solution-driven science prompted Al Leman to begin this conference more than 50 years ago in a classroom on the St. Paul campus. Today, we pledge that we will never lose sight of that simple and challenging purpose. Thank you for attending and for all that you do to keep the swine industry strong.
Thank you, Dean Molgar. Dean Molgar mentioned that we have some new faculty. I wanted to put the pictures of the new faculty here on the screen. See if you see them in the hallway. You can introduce yourself to them. Some faces that you already knew and some faces that are new. So we are excited about that. We also want to thank, as Dean Molgar said, our long colleagues that they've been with us for so long, and they decided to retire, or they are nearing retiring. So we want to thank them as well for their contributions. So we're going to get started with the keynotes. And one of the things I wanted to say before we do that, when we do the planning of the Leman Conference, the whole faculty, we throw our hearts and our minds to try to make the best for the program and for you. And as much as we work to try to make it happen, I want to make sure this audience knows that this is your conference. So we want you to enjoy it. We want you to have conversations, give us feedback, but we see it as this being your conference. And with that in mind, it's how we go about putting together the program. So this is my phone number. Please write it down, text the questions as the speakers present or at the end of their talks, and then we'll relay the questions to them. So to get started, actually the first keynote speaker is Bill Moore, who is the Chief Risk Officer at Compeer Financial. He oversees all credit underwriting and enterprise risk functions. Bill holds both a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting and a Bachelor of Arts in economics. He holds a Chartered Financial Analyst designation and has completed advanced programs in bank credit analysis, statistics, and financial management. He's got extensive experience in investment management at the public financial markets and has held important roles in prestigious financial companies. I'm not going to go through all the details. You can see his bio in the program booklet, but we are very happy that he's here with us today. And just say that at Compeer Financial, Bill has been instrumental in leading initiatives that foster a risk-reward culture, creating a new auto-decision tool, and managing third-party capital relationships. With that, Bill, we would like to welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Monsi. I applaud the attendance for an 8 a.m. meeting on economic landscape. Congratulations for actually just being here. Good morning, I'm Bill Moore. I'm very honored to be here. Actually, my niece is a DVM from the University of Minnesota, so I have a connection to this place. But I also have a connection to agriculture through my work at Compeer, which hopefully you all know Compeer. Figure out how this works on the fly. Green button? Yep. Compeer is part of the farm credit system. I have probably more slides than I have time, so I might speed through a number of things, including Compeer, but hopefully you are aware of Compeer. The one thing I do want to bring forth is, we're about a $35 billion farm credit institution. Swine represents about 6% of our portfolio, which may seem small, but it actually makes us one of the largest swine lenders in the country. I personally am an East Coast suburban kid from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm not an ag guy. I didn't come into farm credit as an ag guy. I'm a numbers guy. I spent about 15 years in New York City as a portfolio manager for fixed income and equity securities, and that's really where my economic perspective comes from. So again, I might blow through these pretty quickly just so we have time for Q&A, but the basis for any economic presentation is US GDP, gross domestic product. It's what we measure the viability of our economy on the goods we sold. And you can see that we're at a time right now on the far right side here where we're in a little bit of a mix. We had Trump's tariff announcements come in April. You saw a lot of front-end loading on imports before those tariffs kicked off in place. and then it reversed itself in the second quarter. But you can see we're kind of humming along here from a GDP perspective in the sort of post-COVID world. But today the consumer has gotten pretty cautious. You may have seen that in your own household, but this is an index of what the sentiment of consumers are by the University of Michigan. And you can see how much it has trended down in the last sort of 12 to 18 months as the consumer is cautious about their job, about their economy, about their financial situation, about inflation, things to that effect. And you can see that while we are at a very low unemployment state, we're about 4.3% today, the convergence of jobs open to people looking for jobs is beginning to converge. In 2022, post-COVID, early 2021, you can see there was a massive gap between labor needed and labor available. The number of jobs open has declined, while the employment hasn't necessarily changed. A lot of those jobs got pulled back. So here we have a situation where we are starting to be concerned about unemployment, even though when you look at it on a historical basis, it's pretty low. 4.3% is a very low unemployment rate. You know, just as a context perspective, when we hit COVID, and granted that was somewhat artificial, we broke 10% on unemployment for a brief period of time. Nevertheless, despite the sentiment, despite the availability of jobs and the employment out there declining, we still have consumer spending. And for those in the back, I have a lot of pictures, so hopefully this works out for you from a distance. I know I wouldn't be able to see from back there. But what we have is a trend of consumer spending. You can see that's Trump's quote-unquote Liberation Day on the slide there. We had a little bit of a flux as people try to figure out what's going on. But actually, at the end of the day, come July, we were back to a pretty normalized spending environment. So anyone who in April and May had said that these tariffs were going to destroy the economy and destroy spending, that didn't end up being the case. We actually ended up at probably a spending spot higher than we were in the first 3 months of the year. But let's talk about those tariffs, because they're particularly important. Tariffs are important because export value, exporting agricultural goods from the United States to different parts of the world, has really driven net farm income for farmers for quite a while. Excuse me, this graph goes back to 1970. You can see up through about 2022 the almost ever increasing amount of agricultural export value that has gone out and how that has translated into net farm income. So world markets are super important. You know, if you take a look at just the pork market, we export about 26% of value to the rest of the world. And if that were to shut down for any one or multiple reasons, that would be a very important negative driver to this industry. We're seeing that with soybeans today, which I'll talk a little bit about later, to a lesser extent corn. But this is how much, just relative, to give you a sense, just global, Minnesota, this is just Minnesota, global pork exports, you know, of the 163 million, the largest exporter is Mexico. They're an extremely important client for us, or a trading partner for us. China's really at number 2. We think a lot about China, but they're not as important to the aggregate market as sometimes they might otherwise be. But one key piece here, and from a non-ag guy like myself, it took me a little while to learn this, but the offal component of the swine contributes, you know, $5 to $8 a head, and it's just product we here in the United States don't typically eat. So if a market like China or Southeast Asia was to go away, it's not like you can turn around and turn that demand domestically. That's $5 to $8. It's essentially gone. So really important for the markets to us. So you might say, man, look at all the tariff news and the tariffs out there. And I will give you, the fact that these tariffs seem to change every week is very difficult to track. But if you take a look post-Liberation Day, you can see a new era of tariffs, and I call it a new-ish era because it's not like we haven't tried this before. And while a lot of counterclaims point to the Smoot-Hawley Bill of 1930, and if you're a Ferris Bueller's Day Off fan, you've probably heard the reference in the movie. Smoot-Hawley was a raise of tariffs at a time when the U.S. was in a massive recession, headed to a depression, if not already in a depression. and it negatively impact it. But we have used tariffs quite considerably in the past. We just haven't for the last 30 or 40 years. And so when you take a look at comments by like Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, or Howard Lutnick, who's the Commerce Secretary, I believe, it's a plan that can work, hasn't been proven to work, but it also hasn't been proven not to work. So it's almost like they're giving it a new try. And in a charged political environment, that just makes it a hot topic for people to talk about. But the reality is if anybody tells you they know what the impact of a particular tariff or a group of tariffs are going to be, they're lying to you. They're making it up. Tariffs are an extremely nuanced economic situation. They depend on a lot of things about how exclusive is the good. Can you replace the good with something else? Can you bring that manufacturing inside domestically? Are you protecting an industry or are you punishing a country? There's an incredible amount of nuance in tariffs, and there's pros and cons. We want to, on the pro side, drive fair trade deals with the rest of the world. The argument of the Trump administration is we've been taking advantage of tariffs on world trade for quite a long time. How do we equalize that balance of trade? How do we protect domestic industries like semiconductors, as a great example, or oil? How do we encourage onshoring and US investment, which has begun to occur? Because if it's going to cost you more to make and distribute in the United States than it would a competitor who's in the United States, well, then maybe I should be investing here and building it here and save that amount of money. We also want to deliver revenue stream for the US government. I think that's a byproduct. I think that's if these things above don't work, well, at least we'll generate some revenue. The flip side is it does create, in many cases, higher input costs for US retailers. We have a very distributed manufacturing system today that's global, so it does increase the cost of goods. The retaliatory response, and that's super important for agriculture. We're trying to reduce our global trade deficit, and it's working. Actually, the tariffs are actually reducing that number. What it's not helping is the ag export trade deficit, because we're so dependent on agricultural exports from here in the United States. So we do have a higher ag trade deficit. I said this in 2018 when we had our first trade war with China. The trade war with China could be productive, but the agriculture producers of the United States are the tip of that spear. They are the front line. They're the ones that take the largest casualties. I just spent a week at Gettysburg learning about leadership at the Civil War, and I got to tell you, watching those presentations, I don't think I'd want to be the person on the front line of those picket charges. I mean, you're just walking into fire, and that's essentially what ag is in a trade war, which is why you're probably going to see some sort of monetary compensation for that, but I'll talk about that later. And it disrupts supply chains. Locally, there's a company here, Polaris, makes equipment. It was really hard for them to produce because they couldn't get a lot of their goods in the early days. And it's politically divisive. And I don't know if you can read this, particularly in the back, but those that view tariffs as good, and you break it down by Democrats versus Republicans, it's a very, very wide split, which is why you're hearing all kinds of bantering news about the topic. It has brought in revenue, though. If you take a look at, this goes back to January of this year, the tariffs really took place in April. We've taken in, between January and July, $80 billion in revenues before some other accounting measures and payroll tax offsets. We've picked up another 30 in just August alone. Treasury Secretary Bessent, who I referenced earlier, he projects about $300 billion per year starting in 2026. That's an incredible inflow for the government. Now, just recently, we've seen a plan where Secretary Rollins, U.S. Ag Secretary, said, hey, maybe we can repurpose some of those dollars into a farm plan that can help out farmers. Whether that's legal or not, unclear. If they have the money for that, it's unclear. Whether the CCC can do that, all unclear. But at least they are thinking about it. Clearly, Secretary Rollins is out in the market talking about farmers, we're going to make sure you're protected. Because again, we understand you're the tip of the spear. Everyone presumes, or the very simplistic is tariffs raise prices. And to a degree they do. It depends on a lot of different things. but it also, in many cases, doesn't. So let's take something as simple as coffee. If you have a tax on Colombia, but not Southeast Asia, you can simply substitute your coffee and probably not see that same increase. So there's a substitution effect. And so this chart, which I took, does show a degree of the domestic impact on prices, the percent of prices that were affected, and the percent of prices that were not affected. And there's actually quite a large degree of products that were not affected from prices. So if you assume tariffs equals inflation, you have to assume that tariffs are driving up prices, and that's not necessarily the case. Imported goods increased by about 4% in early March. That's continued on. Domestic prices increased by 2%, which would be in line with inflation. And what you see here is a survey that was done shortly after April by Deutsche Bank that said, manufacturers and servicers, how much of tariffs do you pass on to the consumer? About 25% said none. 50% or less split the bill. I mean, there's a perfect example. One of our clients had fertilizer coming across from Canada literally on April 3rd, so the day the tariffs were announced. And they wouldn't let the truck through without paying the tariff, and there was a bunch of phone calls. What are we going to do about this increase in price? Well, they split it. The importer took half, the exporter took half. They split the bill. So when you hear that, well, the U.S. consumer bears the brunt of all tariffs, not 100% true. The exporter pays all the tariffs, not 100% true. It's shared. And so there's a big focus, particularly at the Federal Reserve, which controls interest rates, which we'll talk about in a second, to watch what's happening to inflation. The Fed has not cut interest rates since the election, since prior to the election, because they're afraid that the tariff situation is going to drive up prices. Well, you can see our very large, let's see if this works. Oh, yeah, it does. We see this big gap jump here. That was our big run-up of inflation. We had lots of spending. We had lots of money printing going on. It was an economist's dream to analyze inflation, albeit a consumer burden. But we've been able to kind of knock that down. So there's lots of measures of inflation. I could probably stand here and list you 15 of them. Some people look at some people look at the other. The Producer's Price Index came out about 2 weeks ago, and everybody freaked out because the number was high. But what they didn't have the context of is the Producer's Price Index is very volatile. So it jumps up really high, and then it drops down really low, and then it jumps up really high. It's not smooth. But the one I want to point to is the red one. Oop, that's not what I wanted. There we go, is the red one. The red one is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, minus two things, housing and healthcare. Because neither of those two things are really related to tariffs. Those are related to demand and money and assets. We're at 1.6% inflation right now for that measure. So while that's down from about 3, where the general CPI is, what that says is that as an economy, inflation is growing at the pace that the Fed really expects it to, but yet they remain relatively nervous. And why? Well, the Fed has two jobs. It's a balancing act. They want to keep inflation down to 2% or potentially less. The reality is they want to keep it around 2%. And they need to manage unemployment. That's the Fed's only two explicit jobs: employment, inflation. It's a tough balancing act. We obviously have the right employment number. We're at 4.3%. Inflation, depending upon the measure you look at, is higher than 2. So the Fed doesn't want to cut interest rates because that spurs demand. If you spur demand, people spend more money, which drives up prices, assuming supply stays relatively the same. So the Fed is concerned that, hey, if we start cutting interest rates and making things easier to do business in the economy, inflation's going to go back up again. I'd make that argument from the previous slide that we're not really there, but that is their concern. So we just had a meeting. The Fed Open Market Committee meets. There's like 8 governors who vote, 9 governors who vote, and they cut interest rates by 25 basis points. Why? Because there was a dissension growing over the last number of quarters, or last number of months, that the Fed has met, that there are certain governors who want to see interest rates come down. They see the economy slowing and they want to produce it back or push it back up again. This is that group. It changes year to year who gets to vote. Well, I won't go through all these people because frankly, I don't even know all these people. But the reality is this group switches over time, and some are what's called doves, meaning we want to see interest rates lower, we don't care as much about inflation, and others are what's called hawks. And hawks are, we want to make sure inflation's under control and we're willing to have interest rates higher for longer in order to achieve that mission. Well, it's changing. I mean, you have Stephen Moran, who was just appointed in January at the bottom of this list. They took a vote of what interest rates he'd like to see. He voted for a 50 basis point cut last meeting. We didn't get there, but he voted for it. He's brand new to the board. He was a Trump nominee. Lisa Cook is under some potential pressure, legal pressure, whether it's real or not, I can't comment on. But if she was to leave the board, there would be another spot where Trump could potentially nominate someone who will vote to cut interest rates. And I'm not going to go deep into this because I have slides at the end that if I have time for, I'll go through. But why does the Fed need to keep interest rates low? Well, if you look at the burden of the U.S. debt, we have far too much debt for the U.S. government. And again, I'll talk about that later. But that blue line is just the difference in government debt service payments if rates are lowered by 1%. That's how big of a change 1% in U.S. interest rate cuts means to the federal government. So this is a real economic drag if we were to let interest rates stay high for too long. They go and they take a survey of these Fed governors. Hey, where do you think interest rates are going to be next month, next year, 2 years, 3 years, long term? In the most recent, every dot is a voting member, is a member of the committee. And so you can see we're about 4% today. A couple votes came down, but the trend is downward. If you look at the median trend, it's at 3%, which would be 100 basis points, which is 1%. 100 basis points is 1%. Would get us to 3, but look at the dispersion in that long-term list. It's all over the place. It's all over the place for 2020. It's all over the place for 2027, albeit a little bit more centered in those. So there's not certainty here. However, the markets do evaluate their likelihood for rate cuts. The gold line is rate cut expectations by the end of this year. Now, at the time I grabbed this graph, it was before last week, so they are expecting 2 cuts this year. We just had one in September. We might have one in December. Unclear. But by the end of 2026, the market's looking for up to 5 rate cuts, which implies another 3 in 2026. Now, some of that is because they think the economy's turning over and it's going to need it. And the other piece is they think the composition of the board will change and be a little bit more friendly to rate cuts. And what's it done? You know, interest rates are super important, particularly to farmers, because the assets that you carry are financed with debt. The short-term rate, this is the beginning of the year to now, to a week ago, you can see the short-term side has come down. That's what the Fed controls. The Fed controls that left side of that, what's called yield curve. Long-term rates haven't changed that much. In fact, the 10-year actually has come down a little bit, which is good. A lot of benchmarks for fixed assets are based off the 10-year Treasury rate. If you only looked at one Treasury rate every week, look at the 10-year U.S. Treasury. It gives you a sense of what it costs to do business, not on an operating basis, but on a long-term basis. Home mortgages, all things like that are based off the 10-year. We're around 4% now. That's about 50 basis points in from a year ago. Now, inflation translates to interest rates. That's the market's interpretation of what 10 years of treasuries should look like. So the market's not concerned about inflation. If the market was concerned about inflation, this chart would be vertical because they'd say, man, we're going to get a lot of inflation. I'm going to need a higher interest rate in the future to cover for that. No, we're pretty flat. So how does this apply to the ag economy? And I'll pivot a little bit. It's not good. If you look at grains, there's been a really steady decline in grain prices, particularly which peaked around the Ukraine war. When you take 26% or whatever it was out of production because people are fighting a war, getting their fields landmined, Someone has to fill that bill. Like water rushing to open spot, that's what the commodity markets do. Prices went up. But we're now at a spot where most grains are below the cost of production. You're growing something that you know you're going to lose money on, which is, I say farmers have to be the most optimistic people in the world, but they express it in the most pessimistic way they can. And I don't blame them. That's a really difficult thing to say. I'm planting a year's worth of product that I know I'm going to lose money on. And there's really been very limited opportunities. If you look at 2025, the ability to sell 2025 corn has only been profitable 4 times this year. Now, luckily, the best prices of the year was when they were setting insurance prices. But it's really gone down since then. And it's been a very costly business to be in. This is the cost of production. While 2021 was probably the most expensive crop put in the ground, we're not that far off. There's a lot of costs that were driven into 2022, 2023, 2024, or even when fertilizer came in a little bit, it expanded back out again, it's still very, very expensive. And that's translating into losses. We're probably likely to see 2025 to be the 3rd year of losses at the farm level. This happens to be Central Illinois Farm Docs, which you don't read Farm Docs, you should, really interesting publication. It's focused on Illinois, but it's a very good national barometer. So we're probably looking potentially at 4 years of losses once we get through 2026. Now, some government payments have helped offset that, but it's still a rough spot. And you say, but wait a minute, but net farm income is actually pretty good. If we look at this, yeah, it's down, but man, we're notably higher than where we've been before. So shouldn't we be fine? Well, sort of, but it's a tale of two cities. If you're growing livestock, if you're growing swine, if you're growing cattle in particular, things actually are doing all right. Your feed costs have come down quite a bit. There's a lot of demand for your goods. It's the bottom. Now, hogs is a little bit of a trailer here. I'll explain that in a second. But man, look at cattle. Cattle. We had a big dinner in Gettysburg, and there was a cattle farmer with us. I said, well, I guess you're paying for dinner. Because they're in a pretty good spot, but the others are not. So it's a tale of two cities in terms of income. And the U.S. corn growers just put out a survey. This came out, I think, Friday. We asked 1,000 farmers, do you think we're on the brink of a farm crisis? That's a large percentage that said either maybe or yes. It's almost 80%. Yes was almost 50. So there's concern out there. I mean, that's not saying deterioration. That says farm crisis. Some of that is not just corn prices, though. We're losing ground internationally. When you look at what China's level of importance is to the United States, it gets shifted by the fact that they've invested a tremendous amount in Brazil. 15 years ago, Brazil might have been able to grow a crop cheaper than the United States, but it cost them a boatload to get it out of the field and into a consumer's hand. The transportation system stunk, the storage system stunk, the ports stunk. China invested, I think they call it the Silk Road Project, even though really that's focused on Asia, but same concept. They invested a ton of money in Brazil to beef up their infrastructure. Now we're at a spot where Brazil's infrastructure is probably equal to that of ours. And they are taking share in corn, particularly in soybeans. It's more important to us than soybeans because we export more soybeans, particularly to China. And in this case, China is not buying right now. We're in a fight with China, and they're using that as their weapon. Oh, China, where art thou? In 2025, they've not bought any soybeans. Now, this is a negotiating tactic, I believe, because China still needs us from basically now or October to about January. But they're hanging on as long as they can. They're going to eat into their own stocks. They're essentially stress testing their own national security by saying, if we had a prolonged fight with the United States, how long can we last? They're testing that right now. But the detriment to any economic speaker is to have Trump have a major trade negotiation conversation the business day before you're supposed to speak. Trump and Xi talked on the phone on Friday and had quote-unquote productive talks. It wasn't the type of announcement people were hoping for. The markets came down a little bit on that expectation. But I do expect that China will eventually come to the table. They need us. They're trying to move away from us, but they need us. And their current supply will not last until Brazil begins shipping again. So the date is November 1st. We have an agreement through November 1st. Trump and Xi are meeting on October 31st. I expect something to come out around, plus or minus 5 days of that. And you might even see China make a goodwill effort and make a purchase ahead of that meeting. But Brazil is taking over the domination of world trade, particularly, I said, in soybeans. This is soybean experts. You can see how much Brazil has just stepped into this market. Now, Argentina, it plays a little bit of role in that, but another crazy thing, I think it was on Friday night or Saturday, Argentina said there's an attack on the Argentinian peso, which I expected to be a huge news thing this morning. It wasn't, but I think that is a risk. I would just keep an eye on Argentina and what's happening there. For the swine producers, there is a silver lining. U.S. produces a lot of soybeans. We crush some of it here. We've made significant impacts on soy crushing here in the United States. In the last 3 years, there's been 14 soy crushing projects or expansions in place. It's driven the cost of soy meal down. So that's helped the swine producer in terms of input costs. Because soy oil isn't I forget the word I'm looking for, but the saving grace that everybody hoped it was. Some of it is because they allowed China to import chicken fats as a sustainable oil product and still get the tax credit, which is insane. But they've adjusted that now. So you might see that change, but it has been a tailwind for the swine producers. So I do think there's a China deal coming, and you can see the red is up to the first. Let's see, where are we? The red is up to the first trade agreement. The maroon is sort of after the second, which dwindled off. The question is where do we end up next? I surely can't tell you. But I mentioned it's really Mexico that helps the pork industry. They're the #1 export partner. China's more, you see the big blip in 2020 when they had ASF, and they really needed to restock. That was the big bump there. But marginally, they were, as I mentioned earlier, marginally, on the margins, they are beneficial to be a good trading partner. Now, I mentioned swine and the reduction from 2022 to 2025. These are internal Compeer numbers, and the scales aren't the same for the two lines, but this is what we call our acceptable loans, loans that are in good standing, and then what we call our adverse loans, loans that are troubled. You can see the jump that was made in 2022, and it's a 1/10 scale, so again, they're not on the same scale, but you can see how much adversity crept into the swine portfolio. Our worst period that I'm aware of, I joined the Farm Credit System in early 2014, but my understanding is the period from 2007 to 2009 is one of the worst swine economic environments that we've had. It was over 3 years. Well, in the 18 months from 2022 to 2023 and into early 2024, we experienced as much loss as in 2007 to 2009 in half as much time. And so you had a real big jump in adversity. Now, the good news is this is a backwards-looking number. It looks historically. We're at a spot now where quite a difference a year makes. I love this. I got this from our swine experts. The 12-month Macon Bacon Index. It gives a sense of what the projected margins are for swine producers, and you can see how much it's gone up. A group called CIH does commodity hedging. They put out a bi-weekly margin calculation. If you use the futures market and the current prices, this is where you're at, and they benchmark those dollars, so a little over $12 in margin, over a 10-year period of time. How does $12 fit in over the last 10 years? We're at the 99.4 percentile. You basically can't get better than that over the last 10 years. So the good news is they're back on track. We have what we call weighted average probability of default. It's pretty high for the swine producers, but we fully expect it's going to come down because most of them are making money now. I'll skip through this quickly, and they go in reverse order. Whoever made this slide for me, I need to change it. It goes this way, which drives me crazy. But you can see that the vast difference we've seen in revenue changes versus cost of production. We have a database at Compeer. I'm not going to go detailed into this, but it spans across the country. It represents about 20% of the swine industry. It's equivalent to the Iowa State number, but we get a little bit more detail. And you can see the balance sheet. Swine producers are in pretty good spot. They're 50% equity on average. Again, that's the middle number. Working capital is about $800 per sow. They have about $1,200 in fixed debt. You can kind of go through this and make some assumptions, but if you want to look at the profit and loss, take a look at 2023. The cost of production was almost $96, and the revenue was only $78. You were losing $19 a hundredweight. Break even was nowhere near where you're at. So there was a big adjustment for them to get through into 2024, and as we project into 2025 and 6, we actually see good things for them. But pork consumption is something we got to work on. I know Luke will be on after me. Luke's going to talk a little bit about the consumer and pork demand and what our expectations are as an industry for consumers. But man, we got to work on pork consumption. We got to develop new markets. There are some places where pork will work and some places they won't, but we need to develop that. Why? Well, because Brazil's starting to catch up to what they did in grains to what they're doing in hogs. Their competition is becoming fiercer and fiercer. Now, this is the longer-term thing I was talking about. The U.S., in my opinion, has a spending problem. We had this big, bold, big, and beautiful, I bracket that bill, which did have some really good things for farmers. Change in tax relief on the salt cap, on the death tax. We had safety and cost improvements for the disaster programs. We had expanded small business deductions. We had improved 45Z extensions. We had rural investment, all in that bill, all good stuff. And it's big, bold, and what? And beautiful? Well, he doesn't think so. What was the split between Trump and Elon Musk was the spending. The big, bold, beautiful bill, in his opinion, was not beautiful at all. It was full of, no pun intended, pork. And so if you took a look at the budget on the forward forecasting basis, it increased deficits over the next 10 years, which is the exact opposite that Elon Musk had joined the administration to help out on. Because in their cooperative perspective, in order to get the U.S. economy and budget deficit and fiscal responsibility on equal pillars, you had to have some tax and regulatory relief. They've done some of that. You had to get tariff revenue or the inverse investment in the United States. Those are the tariff revenue is happening, the investment might be, but that final pillar, spending cuts, didn't happen. I mean, you heard for months about Doge. I mean, Doge contributed about this much to the savings. And while we kicked the can down the road, while the budget deficit kind of helped us in the short term, it just pushed all those expenses out to the future. So we continued to have very, very large deficits. Now, there's two economic points you need to think about. There's deficits. How much am I losing in a year? And there's debt. How much is accumulating over time? And as I mentioned, the Fed, but also fiscally, there's value in being able to insert money into the economy to help it out. But in theory, you should do that when things are bad, and then do austerity when things are good, bring it back. But this is probably the only math chart in here. But this is a regression about when the unemployment's at a certain level, how big of a deficit can and did we run? And you can see they're pretty correlated. When our unemployment rate's high, the government puts out more money. That's pretty normal. Keynes would be very happy with that. Keynes is an economist, sorry. But look at these low dots on the left-hand side. We're running big budget deficits at a time when unemployment was super low. We have a spending problem. And over history, and this is something I'm really hanging my hat on, over history, recessions happen every 5 to 7 years, pretty regularly. Things get a little bubbly, the bubble bursts, big or small, asset values come down, things get reset, people who are over-leveraged, frankly, go bankrupt. You know, the old Warren Buffett saying, when the tide goes out, you find out who's not wearing swimming trunks. That's what a recession does. It resets things. If I would have a smaller group, I'd ask this to the crowd, but when's the last time we had a recession? 15 years ago. The Great Recession was the last time the U.S. had a recession. And so we keep spending in order to sort of eliminate recessions. But I would argue that's not a good thing. It just creates a divergence in incomes, in asset values. If you take a look at, and I don't have this in here, but if you take a look at the split between people who live, I'll call it day to day and slightly beyond that, so some savings, and you compare that to how people who have significant asset investment, we've gone like this. It's why we have such divergence in this country, because there's two different economies, and mostly it's because we're propping up the assets over time and saying, guess what, folks? If you invest in an asset, you don't lose money, because we'll come in and save you. And I mentioned austerity. Austerity is this cutting back. It's a global economics term. This is corporate debt, non-financial corporate debt, so it takes things away like student loans and housing debt. This is corporations' debt. And in about 2022, they started to cut back. Now, you could argue they're still too high, but they've certainly cut back. They don't have as much debt as they used to. That's the U.S. government. That trend did not stop. We continue to spend more and more, and to do that, we have to borrow money. Every program we create, including helping the farmers, which will get paid maybe by tariffs, but comes from borrowing money. And that's what we keep doing. We're at a spot now where the U.S. Treasuries as a percent of GDP is a little over 100%. I mean, that's not Banana Republic level, but it's headed in that direction. And so I'll leave with this final quote, and then I think we got some time for questions. Jamie Dimon, he's probably the most respected, well-known bank CEO out there. I think he's been in the role for maybe 25 years, maybe more. He spoke at a conference I went to. I think he's a registered Democrat. It was a Reagan conference, so it was interesting to hear him speak. But he added these things. The U.S. has added $100 trillion in 5 years. Under Reagan, debt to GDP was 35%, and the deficit was 3.5%. So 3.5% of GDP was the spending more than we were taking in. Today, net GDP is over 100, and the deficit is 2 times that. It's the highest level in peacetime. And as he said, frankly, I don't trust the CBO's forecasts. They don't stress test. So the CBO puts out numbers, but they don't do stress testing. If we hit a recession, which some people think we're on our way to, that 7% of spending could quickly become 10, it could become 11, it could become 12, depending upon what type of serious problems we have or not. So he addressed many of the causes, and the proposed solutions came from what he was calling these tectonic shifts. And I'll leave you with this final quote, which really stuck with me. When tectonic shifts happen, bad things follow. It's hard to see them in real time, but they're happening. I hope we change course before this happens. Also, a reminder, in bad markets, it's not big banks that suffer the most, it's small businesses, asset-backed securities, middle market firms, and even the U.S. government. Volatility scares people. They pull back. He didn't say that, I did. Sometimes markets even close. We've seen it. High-yield bond markets freezing up, treasury markets wobbling. So yes, it's coming. And it may take a crisis to wake us up. I don't know if this crisis comes in 6 months or 6 years. That's how he ended his presentation. I found that to be like a knife through the heart in terms of, wow, this guy's really smart. He really understands a lot of aspects of the business, and he's scared. So with that, I think we're good. Sorry to leave you on that last note there. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Bill. Don't go too far. So we do have time for questions, the phone number. And I have one just to get it going, but please text us more questions. So you just were saying that part of the last part of the presentation, that some of the expenses, they just basically kicking down the road. But how can producers really prepare for that in the environment that we are?
Unfortunately, producers are mostly price takers. So our messaging is risk management. It's how do you plan like a business? I was listening to a podcast on the way in here this morning that said many producers could probably lock in a portion of their production in 2026 at break-even levels or slightly better. But many are gamblers, and they'll sort of wait for better opportunities. And we do see this cyclically. We see when markets are good, the year after, the risk management protections are worse because everybody says, man, I had a pretty good year last year. I don't want to waste that money again, and then it reverses itself. So for us, it's about penciling in, what do I think is going to cost me to produce, and then have a marketing plan that says, in some cases, what's the worst I'll lose, which is an unfortunate situation to be in, or what am I going to make? Like, we don't make widgets. We make a production cycle that is alive and moves. And so you really have to balance that. You maybe cut back on fertilizer is what I'm hearing a little bit. It's not going to be gone. The swine producers, you could probably save $60 or $70 if you use manure instead of purchased fertilizer. So again, another advantage for swine producers, although trucking it makes it a little bit more expensive. You can't go that far. But it's things like that of where can you save money on the edges.
One thing that you didn't cover, Bill, was about labor. And the swine industry, as part of many agricultural industries, depends on labor, and also labor from other countries that come and work. And some of the immigration policies are getting more difficult. Can you elaborate again on the impact for producers?
To a degree. I think the surge in undocumented workers has been difficult because in theory those people can't and are not supposed to work. Many do. There really needs to be immigration reform. I do think both parties in some form or another want that. We need the human labor on the ground. It's causing people, though, to invest in technology. They don't want to be reliant upon labor. I think the great example is the dairy industry, which has moved towards robotic milkers. It's a significant capital expenditure up front. You need it to be able to pencil out over time. But it eliminates that need for maybe one or two workers, which can mean a whole difference to an operation. So immigration reform is important. We want immigration. We want it legally so that we're doing it appropriately. But those incremental changes in investment in technology are probably going to be the thing that gaps the difference.
Okay. Another question that just came from the audience. If Fed debt continues to grow, do you think we will eventually enter a period of fiscal dominance where raising interest rates will increase money or going out? How do we get out of it then?
I get asked the question about how we get out of it a lot, and I'm not smart enough to have a great answer other than I think fiscal responsibility is the key thing. I mean, we need to probably reform Social Security and other entitlement programs. I'm not talking about eliminating benefits for people who are, I'm 55, I'm not that far away from retirement, but my children are 22 and 23. I think the chances of them participating in that program are low. So how do you adapt things like that? But the more severe cases, a couple places like in Europe, in the 2009, 2010 timeframe, they had to massively cut back government spending, which creates unrest in the people. It is not a pleasant time, but it's the only way you can get places like the IMF or the World Bank to help you out if you show that you're on the path to, again, I'll use that word again, austerity, it's just not a fun process. So the earlier you can make a dent in it, the less pain you'll have in the future. I don't have a grand plan as to how to get there, though.
Okay. Another question. Does the import of, or even wing pigs from Canada and Mexico that are sold in U.S. throw off the trade deficit and make it look worse than it is? The import of values and then wing pigs from Canada and Mexico. Then.
It does. I think we'd be better off looking at a North American statistic. than just the United States because the integration between Canada and Mexico on the food supply basis. The one positive part, USMCA, which is the former NAFTA, did get exempted from many of the tariffs that were in place there. So that does expire at some point. I'm not sure when, but that's been able to at least keep those flow of goods. But I tell you, a lot of Wisconsin dairy farmers would like to see some tariffs imposed upon Canada because they find them to be unequal in terms of their trade balance. But the short answer is I think we will always have a ag trade balance just because we're the source of food for so much of the world. It's just a matter of can we make it up in other things?
And are the grain producers already in recession?
I don't think I'd use the word recession, but I think there are definitely storm clouds on the horizon. For us, grain farmers, land values have, I took out a slide on land values. Land values have remained solid despite the change in pricing, commodity pricing. You also had a period from 2021, and even parts of 2020 into 2022, where grain farmers were able to build up a lot of working capital. We have an underwriting statistic that says you should have X amount of working capital per acre, and by 2023, the average clients we had were 3 times that level. Now they're only 2, so they're eating into it a degree, and the environment is changing, but they came from such a solid economic base, and particularly in 2020 and 2021, farmers make a lot of money. One thing they do is they spend a lot of money. But in 2021 and 2022, there was nothing to spend on. You couldn't buy anything. So they built up their balance sheets. They're now eating into those balance sheets. We think 2026 will be a negative year, but I think we'll have to see a full year of sustained prices in order to see a recession come to that market, and it probably doesn't begin until 2027.
Okay. Maybe one last question. Compeer doesn't want to own a lot of pig farms, right? How do you manage ISF or even the H5N1 impact for U.S. pork producers?
Well, we don't want to own any, just to be clear. If we're owning a pig farm, something bad happened. But that being said, I think we do evaluate the biosecurity of our clients with extreme caution. Understanding distances between farms, understanding in-house biotechnology routines. I've been on swine farms. I've had to do the shower in, shower out. That was a very unique experience for me. It is an important part of our underwriting criteria, but I think it's equally as important to our clients as it is to us, because you have a PRRS outbreak or, God forbid, an ASF outbreak here in the United States, that could be very damaging to an individual operation. It could be damaging to an entire industry. We ran some scenarios about 3 years ago on ASF, and things can go 2 different ways. You could have a single site incident which hurts obviously that borrower but keeps it regionally contained, and you could have a shortage of supply which actually drives prices up, or you could have a wider spread ASF issue, and then there's no supply at all. There's nowhere, there is supply, but there's nowhere to sell it to, and the price collapses. So it's difficult.
Last question, but quick answer then. How much longer can farmers continue to leverage land value, and what strategies do you see most critical for the U.S. to be competitive against Brazil? So give us some quick answers.
Whoa, a couple quick answers. That's easy. I think the short answer is I think there's still room to leverage land values as long as they stay reasonable and can pencil out. I think we think there's strong demand for land, both on a farmer basis as well as an institutional basis. You have a number of large institutions that are saying, hey, what's this asset class that doesn't have a lot of volatility in it, and they are investing in it. We're seeing that in like the Chicago area as an example, investors looking into land. So I think there's still time to leverage the value of land. Our average loan to value in our book is in the 50%. So there's room to maneuver there. But that being said, interest rates are higher now than they were, so it's a little harder to pencil out. How do we compete against Brazil? I'm not sure we can compete against them as much as we can develop our own markets. You'll probably hear a term when you talk about global trade of BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And they've made a sort of trade pact. They're a global trade group We need to create something counter to BRIC. European Union, we could pull in Africa, places of the Southeast where we have a US-dependent trade agreement that sells protein, that sells grain, that sells energy. That's the way I think we compete, not by trying to steal their markets, but by developing further ones.
Well, thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Bill,
you
for
very
the
much. I
presentation.
appreciate it.